Well, what's up again, guys? Brian here at 3TR, here to give you my review on my most anticipated movie of 2017, that being Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk. Now, I'm going to get my fandom out of the way first. Now, for those of you who've been watching my channel long enough, you know that Christopher Nolan is my all-time favorite director of all time, and he's been my favorite director since 2006's The Prestige, so a little bit before The Dark Knight. And pretty much every movie that he has made before and since then has just been a masterpiece and an excellent movie to watch. His last movie, Interstellar, to this day probably remains one of the most impressive visually space movies I've ever seen. His most popular movie, The Dark Knight, is tied dead center with James Cameron's Terminator 2. To this day, I still do not know which one of these films is better. And on top of those two films, he also directed my all-time favorite movie of all time, Inception. I have seen this movie at least 100 times, and every time I see it, I am still impressed. Now, that being said, when I heard that Christopher Nolan was going to be tackling a World War II film, more specifically the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940, I was ecstatic because I'm a huge history buff, especially when it comes to World War II. Now, with that out of the way, the plot of this movie takes place in 1940, May, and pretty much you have 400,000 Allied troops, both Brit and French, as they are trapped on this beach in France of Dunkirk, and they're surrounded by overwhelming forces of Germans. And the movie pretty much focuses on the evacuation and kind of show you the atmosphere and the tension of having these very, very scared group of men trying to simply get away. And it pretty much ends, which is probably no secret, when the Allied forces pretty much make a call to have any civilian with a boat pretty much go across the channel, pick up these soldiers, and take them home. Now, that being said, I'm going to go over what I think are two of the weaker aspects of this film, because I still really enjoyed this film from beginning to end. However, there are two elements I think that I wish they had either expanded upon or they had somehow found a way to fix. Now, the first element that I think is the weakest is the cast. Not necessarily the cast's acting themselves, but it's the fact that this movie really never really focuses on any one character. Now, some would say that that's not a bad thing because this movie is focusing on the situation and not the characters. But the problem is that because we don't really get to know the characters at all, it makes it really, really hard for me to care about these characters. I mean, despite this movie's length, which, to be honest, it's actually not even all that long, I can't even tell you any of these characters' names. I mean, maybe if I look it up on IMDb or if I had waited for the credits, but the fact that I don't know these characters, they don't have an arc, it makes it impossible for me to care for them, even in this very, very tense situation. So if any of them were to die, I simply just wouldn't care. And another thing that I also think was a little bit lacking was the presence of the French forces. Now, the way that this movie kind of projects this situation is that the Germans are like really close to this group of men that are trapped on this beach. I mean, they're like literally right down the street. And despite the fact that this movie is being told in three perspectives, I really wish that there was a fourth perspective that kind of shows who is holding off these Germans, giving these Allied forces that are trapped on the beach the time to escape. It just focuses on the evacuation and not so much the defense. Now, I know that that probably might have messed with the tone a little bit because you have three perspectives focusing on the evacuation and one that is focusing on the defense. But I really would have appreciated that more because of how short this movie is. It's actually not even 2 hours long, which I was really surprised about. But again, that doesn't hurt the film too much. Those are just two things I think that they should have added, and I think would have added a little bit more to the film. Now, what the movie gets really fantastically done, it's just about everything else. The cinematography in this film is absolutely incredible, just like in any Christopher Nolan film. He is able to capture shots without the use of digital filming. He's like one of the last directors that still likes to film on practical film, and that really shows you what it can still do when you don't need to focus too much on digital effects. And the fact that everything in this film is so practical, I think gives him a lot more credit than most directors. I think if any other director had tried to do this, they probably would have added a lot of CGI, and that probably would not have made the tensefulness of this situation as impactful. Another thing that he also handles very masterfully is the sound design and the music. No one knows how to handle music as well as Christopher Nolan, to the point where it kind of feels like its own character. I mean, this entire movie is so tense from beginning to end that at some points the music takes complete control of the film and it controls your emotions because you simply know that something is coming and it's not good. And I don't think any other director could capture that emotion as well as Christopher Nolan. Another thing that I also really liked was the action. There isn't really too much action in this film, and most of it really centers on more of the aerial dogfights. But because it's so practical, it's probably some of the most impressive dogfighting that I've seen for a World War II film in some time. I would even say these dogfights are a little bit more impressive than the ones I saw in the film of Red Tails, which was a movie I also really enjoyed. Another thing that I also really enjoyed was the fact that it pretty much stayed. I think it did a somewhat loyal job of actually projecting the soldiers. Now, I've heard some people complain that they don't like how all the Brits are acting as cowards, but I think that if you understand the situation, I think this is quite accurate because these guys are scared. They're very, very scared because they understand that they're in a really bad situation. So I don't think anyone would have that, last stand mentality. These guys are just desperate and they are willing to do anything it takes. Even some are willing to kill each other or steal the dog tags and close off of dead bodies in order to get out. I think it captures how these soldiers would have felt very, very accurately. And that really makes it stand out as being one of the best World War II films I've ever seen, if not best war films, despite the fact that there is not really a lot of blood. I mean, for a PG-13 movie, and to not go that extra mile and show you the horror of war, I think it's impressive, because this movie does not try to project the horror of war, but more of the fear of war and what it is like to be trapped in a very, very bad situation. And I think that because it does that so well, it gets some extra credit in my book. Now, if I had to give Dunkirk a rating, I'm going to give it an A-. This is still a great film, a great war film, a great projectile of a moment in World War II. If you can see it on the biggest screen that you can, because I certainly saw this in IMAX. Actually, I saw it once, and then the second time I saw it in IMAX, it was totally worth it. Then I think you're going to have a very, very fun time at the movies, because it does not disappoint. If you like my movie review, feel free to like, comment down below, and please subscribe to my future movie reviews. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I'll see you next time.